let me introduce our stellar guest this evening. Tom Harwood is GB News's deputy political editor and news presenter with a daily show. Prior to that, he was a reporter for the Westminster news and gossip website Guido Fawkes, which is surely known to all of you, a columnist for several papers, including The Telegraph and The Mail, as well as popping up on all sorts of TV platforms with analysis and comment. Before journalism, Tom ran a number of campaigns. Most notably, he ran the national student arm of the Vote Leave campaign. And less seriously, I'm told he ran to be the president of the National Union of Students on a pledge to use its funds to construct a fully functioning real-life Death Star, which would probably be a better use of NUS funds than what they actually spend it on. Outside of work, he says his biggest accomplishment in his life, I think this is a rather modest thing, biggest accomplishment of his life was building a full-sized fiberglass Dalek with his dad when he was in primary school. I didn't know you were a Doctor Who fan, Tom. Welcome, welcome. Great to have you with us. How are you doing, sir?
Oh, it's great to be here. I have to say I've one-upped you on the water. I'm already on the beer. It's 7 o'clock. We had a rule when I was at Guido Fawkes. When it hit 5 o'clock, you had to get on either to the pub or to meeting contacts or whatever. And I sort of basically stuck to that rule since leaving. It's 5 o'clock somewhere, as we say.
That's what I like. An employer who makes alcohol consumption compulsory. Very good to hear. There should be more of that in the British labour market. Now, Tom, let's kick off with, I should tell roughly the questions that I'm hoping our audience can throw in. I'm going to be talking about the changing media landscape in the UK, the impressive rise of GB News, but some of the challenges it faces and some of the criticisms it's facing, and whether we are basically going through a kind of media broadcasting revolution, and perhaps we're only partway through it at the moment. But Tom, let's start with GB News. I think we were saying it was launched in 2021, had a slightly sort of sticky launch with sort of things going wrong and microphones not quite working, but has now really found its feet, hasn't it? Could you give us some sort of indication of how well is it doing in terms of audience against its competitor channels?
Yeah, it's been a completely wild ride. I mean, the first couple of months were incredibly choppy, but for someone who was, on the younger end of journalists who joined, that was actually sort of a massive opportunity as well as being deeply chaotic. So from a personal perspective, I'd been doing all sorts of sort of media interviews on, Sky, the BBC, Channel 4, ITV, popping up. In particularly 2019, I was sort of doing one of these shows almost every other day and sort of popping up everywhere, doing so much of stuff as a guest. So then sort of becoming a political correspondent, that was kind of quite a smooth transition to GB News. But then suddenly a number of presenters are shuffled around over that first summer. We've got some news reports about 0 viewers registering on certain shows. I think it only happened once or twice, but that of course became the sort of meme about GB News in that first summer. And so that was an amazing sort of testing ground where they were able to throw new people into situations. Within a few weeks there, I was suddenly reading autocue for the first time in my life. And because it was so chaotic, there was sort of an advantage to that. They sort of threw people at the camera and sort of see who worked, see who got on with it, and what a sort of testing ground. And then over the sort of ensuing months and years, the audience built up. We ended up surpassing and supplanting Talk TV. Then for the last 2 months, we've been ahead of Sky News as well. This is across the whole day average. So every day we get figures in through from the previous day from Barb, the sort of official registered broadcasters group. And they show us the numbers from 6 a.m. through to 2 a.m. And we get these daily, and sort of we build up a picture of what shows are doing well, how things are growing, and the growth that there's been, actually particularly since the general election, has been quite profound. I think perhaps we were on a third higher than we were before the general election, and that over a short period of time adds to the sort of more modest rises that we saw before. So we can now comfortably say that over the last few months on average, we have been the #1 commercial news station in the UK. There are some days where the BBC just gets very high audiences, and so their average get gets boosted. There seems to be some sort of default sort of reflex amongst the British public when some major news happen, people go for the BBC. So whilst on a lot of days we're ahead, the big days the BBC wins, and so the average they're still ahead. But it does seem to be that they have been folding their news operations in a slightly different way. So the BBC recently amalgamated the BBC World and BBC domestic news channels. So if you watch the BBC News channel now, very often it's dealing with foreign news and perhaps not as relevant to the UK. So that has been an advantage for us. And then Sky, of course, I think ever since they were taken over by Comcast, ever since the Competition Commission said that Murdoch couldn't have them and he divested. And that was all around the time of the Brexit stuff. I think people very sensibly for a long time thought Sky News was sort of centrist, maybe even centre-right. But clearly, ever since 2016, 2017, I think it's gone in a very, very different direction, and that's upset a lot of its previous core audience. So what I'm trying to say with all of this is that there was a gap in the market for GB News. I think a lot of people want a media plurality. We've got a very healthy media plurality when it comes to our newspaper market that provides sort of perspectives and views from across the political spectrum. But for the longest time, we had none of that diversity in television. In fact, the only diversity that we had was sort of centrist, centre-left, and even further left, thanks to the introduction of Channel 4 by Margaret Thatcher. Of course, great plurality of media, but a very, very big gap on the centre-right of the media spectrum. So whilst GB News doesn't intend to have a corporate view, it wants to provide a space to the people that might not be heard on the other channels. And that's a real gap in the market.
Yeah. And what have been the sort of the main challenges to you? I mean, do you think television news can ever actually be commercial in the sense that it could be profit making, or do you think increasingly channels are going to have to rely on philanthropists, as often the magazine market does, or indeed the newspaper market, who think that it's an important public service and is a sort of public spirited charity, perhaps, that that your big donors or funders or owners are just sort of are keen and committed to there being a polarity of views, but you'll never make the books balance on advertising. You might bring in a bit, you might bring in a bit on subscriptions. Do you think that's the way the news TV market is going to be? I mean, obviously the BBC can force us to pay for them, but in other areas, it's going to require philanthropy and to run at a loss as a kind of public service provided by private money.
I think in the UK, media has always been that sort of philanthropic venture. I mean, we can look back to the Victorian paper barons, or we can look to today's TV companies. I mean, the BBC is obviously funded through a tax. Sky News makes tens of millions of pounds of losses every single year. It's subsidised by the profitable other arms of the Sky company. Of course, sport is very profitable, and their television boxes that they sell and all the rest of it, that subsidises the news operation for Sky, and it's almost a prestige arm of the company. They go off and they win awards, and they're not too worried about the number of people that are watching. And similarly, we've seen that when Murdoch tried his Talk TV venture, it couldn't make any money at all. It made big losses, and so was changed in the way that they approached it. That being said, there have been some newspapers that have cracked it. I mean, the Guardian doesn't make money. It never makes money. It just has a massive sort of fund that helps fund its journalism. That's one way to do it. But the Times and magazines like The Spectator have been able to provide huge amounts of revenue through their subscription services. And building that sort of quality publication has been able to make them a profitable business. I think investors in all of these businesses always know that if you invest in some big AI company, you're probably going to make a lot more money than if you invest in news or in journalism. But that's not what people who invest in news and journalism are after. It's much more of a public service, what people who want to get involved in this sort of thing are doing in terms of the big backers. But ultimately, GB News in and of itself has been becoming more and more profitable. We're not profitable yet, but the trend has been very, very much positive more recently. The website is the fastest growing news website in the United States and has been the fastest growing news website in the UK for some time now. And the membership program in GB News is also something that's very important, because the whole point about GB News, much more than a sort of arm's length news sort of service, it's much more like a community where people interact, and viewers feel like they have ownership of the community, feel like they're part of something. It's much more, well, I suppose the corporate lingo is it's a family more than a business. But that's the sort of game plan for all of this. It's got to be something that I think is a mix of free, freemium, and premium, as all of these news services end up being. There'll be sort of exclusive stuff for the membership tier, but also stuff that's mass consumption too.
Yeah, yeah. Do you think that we're moving into a world? I mean, notwithstanding that, you've said your viewing figures are healthy and going up, but do you think we're moving away from broadcasting and into narrowcasting, and almost TV as a concept will die? I mean, people will presumably have a screen in their living room, as I do, but you'll plug it into YouTube or Netflix or your computer, or it's just a screen. And the idea that you can't really distinguish, but I mean, I tend to watch GB News on my mobile phone on YouTube, right? Is television going to be dead as a kind of platform? And actually, it will all be either on YouTube or some other platform, or just streaming off the GB News website or whatever. Is that the way, do you think, we are going to go? I mean, I think Sky looks like it might well leave. I think it's called linear television, so you can presumably go onto their website or watch them live on YouTube, but you wouldn't be able to go to channel 502 or whatever it is to actually tune into it. Do you think that's right? Is TV for news going to be dead? Or indeed for anything? You just got a sort of cinema screen in your house and you pick what you plug it into and what you watch.
I think it's a fool's errand to try and predict the future in, 20 years' time. But if I were to have to put money on it, yes, I think the way that we consume media is going to be completely different in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, to how we consume it now. I think it's going to be much more personalized. Hey, I mean, I might be out of a job. We might all be able to get AI to just sort of tell us our exactly tailored news in any way that we want. Perhaps that's the future. I mean, here's a secret. It's not really a secret. We say it every, if anyone has ever listened to GB News Radio, they'll know that the sports broadcasts on GB News Radio are all AI voice generated. My colleague Tatiana Sanchez has put a voice into an AI, and it sounds like her. And if it didn't say this is your AI news report, you wouldn't know. But the sports report on GB News Radio is already done all by AI. But I think the way in which we approach news brands, it won't be so much sort of as if the TV is the linchpin and everything else is peripheral. I think there'll be a digital entity that is the linchpin, and there will be all these different sort of things. There will, of course, be some sort of live streaming, whether we want to call it TV or otherwise. I think that will always exist in a form. People will always want to see things that are live and that are happening, but also a lot of people will want to see things much more on demand. I think there's going to be a big mix of all of this stuff, but that's why I think the GB News decision to make gbnews.com the sort of center of the business, and there's so much more, I don't know, symbiosis between the website and the linear channel and sort of everything else that we do is, and of course, GB News is huge on places like TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, all of these different platforms as well. It's almost like this sort of hub and spoke model of what a news business is becoming. I think the only thing that you can possibly do to be sensible in a world like this that's changing so rapidly is to sort of have fingers in every single pie going. Because the one certain bet is that things will look very different in the coming years.
Are you at all worried? I mean, I'm not sure whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. It could be a good thing, but on the face of it, it feels like a bad thing. that we might be losing the public square, that we get the diversity now. And you could imagine, you're quite right, it's a fool's errand to predict, but perhaps there's a sort of 100 British news channels in 20 years' time, and they all cater for slightly different markets or people of a particular different inclination one way or another. But there's no public square left. So we just end up in our echo chambers that sort of, people of a sort of GB News view of the world consume GB News, but never watch John Sopel or Emily Maitlis. Centrist dads watch, Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell, but never watch you on GB News. Do you think we could be losing that public square, that actually a kind of major national debate doesn't really take place anymore because we're all in our own silos? I mean, I only watch GB News now. I can't remember the last time I put on, BBC. But is there something unhealthy about that, do you think, that we'll be, we'll all be in our own little echo chambers, not really understanding how people of a different viewpoint or philosophy approach unfolding events and political commentary?
Yeah, I think that would be unhealthy. And it's why I think that sort of I yawn when I see Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart interviewing John Major for the 10th time. And just all of these people agree with each other on absolutely everything. But that's why I think some of the best interviews that I've seen on GB News are when people who have profound different opinions on things and profound disagreements have a discussion. That's what a platform like GB News should be there for. But also, I think you can have a media plurality, and you have it much more in the United States than you do in the UK when it comes to broadcast, that still has cultural moments that are shared. I mean, Gavin and Stacey this Christmas was the most watched piece of television outside of sport that the country has seen in years and years and years. And you see it too with Netflix shows. When they're a phenomenon, they're a phenomenon. And vast shares of the population watch these things. And it almost doesn't matter where they're on. When something is really good, and perhaps this less applies to news and more applies to media, to film, to TV moments. When something is culturally significant, it still finds a way of bursting through all of those different silos. But I do accept the point, and I do think it would be a disadvantage if all of these different sort of whether it's the podcast sphere or linear TV or anything like that, if people only stayed within their own silos, that would be a bad thing. So I mean, I know that I do, and my colleagues were always encouraged, when we're invited onto the BBC. I mean, I was on Newsnight on Friday. I mean, when people are invited on to these shows, the advice generally from the higher ups at GB News is absolutely go out and of course the cross-pollination, let 1,000 flowers bloom. Ultimately, the best thing is for those silos to puncture each other as much as humanly possible.
Barry Malpass asks that question. He wants to know, how can we all come together as a country if we watch different news? But maybe there is that cross-pollination and approach. Where do you think it leaves, in my wild idea that television is dead or is dying, and we're just going to have a whole plethora of different platforms? As you say, a TV news station like GB News already broadcasts on a whole diverse range of platforms. What on earth is the point of Ofcom? Why should we regulate GB News and ensure it's even-handed and balanced? But, we might have 1 million Brits watching the Joe Rogan show on YouTube, which wouldn't, is completely unregulated. Isn't the cat out of the bag now? Back in the days when you had sort of, you could only get your news from the BBC, which had its own sort of regulatory framework, or ITV. You could understand that ITV might have to have placed on its shoulders the burden of being even-handed, making sure that you were fair to all political parties and all political viewpoints. That's just gone now, though, hasn't it? Because you can say and do what you like on YouTube. You can watch YouTube broadcasts from anywhere else in the world. The state regulator can't touch it. Is it time to just kill off Ofcom?
Please don't give them ideas, Mark. I mean, we've seen in Canada there was a controversial law proposed by the Trudeau government, which would have meant that sites like YouTube would have had to promote content that the government decreed was Canadian enough because they were worried about, cultural influence from America. Similarly, we've seen that Ofcom is taking on a lot of roles to regulate and police the internet, particularly when it comes to what the government argue is child safety, but what will inevitably spread beyond that. To some extent, Ofcom has expanded its powers in a huge, huge way ever since the Online Safety Bill, well, now the Online Safety Act has passed. A lot of that's coming into force this spring and summer. I think there's going to be a huge amount of Ofcom regulation of the internet, and perhaps that's when a conversation will start about goodness me, this regulator that was set up to just say, regulate half a dozen TV channels and is now regulating, well, our entire lives. I mean, it's hard to think of something you can't do online. Has this regulator grown too big? And will, as all massive regulators that simply become engorged with power, will they topple with just too much to do?
Yeah.
I think your analogy of Joe Rogan is interesting because, of course, Joe Rogan doesn't broadcast from the United Kingdom. He broadcasts from the United States, and it might well be that we end up with a sort of pirate radio analogy, where Ofcom doesn't like all these naughty things being said, but you know what? Everyone listens to them anyway. Will that sort of make the British regulated internet almost irrelevant? I mean,
on a prosaic point, Tom, it doesn't go to news, but I'm quite a fan of NFL, American football. And in order to, it is broadcast on Sky, but you can take out a subscription to NFL.com so you can watch any game that you want for, I don't know, this, $100 a season or some such like. And then the interesting thing is that the adverts you get are clearly American advertisements, which would technically be illegal in the UK. For example, in the UK, I don't think you can't advertise prescription medicines, for example, whereas in the US you can. So I'm merrily sitting here with my laptop plugged into my screen watching the New Orleans Saints typically lose to whoever they're playing that given week. But then all these adverts pop up, which the Advertising Standards Agency might say, oh, you could never show that on ITV or GB News or Sky, but it's being broadcast into my living room. It's beyond their regulatory remit, isn't it? So if you really wanted to affect, I'm not suggesting GB News is doing this, but if you had a political mission to try and affect British public opinion by particularly favouring one party or one particular cause, then you just go off to Austin, Texas, buy a studio there, and if it's popular with the British people, how on earth is a regulator going to stop them accessing it?
Yeah, that's true. Although the thing is, Ofcom can still say that you can't have your bandwidth on the broadcasting spectrum, and I think that one of the reasons why GB News chose to do, because ultimately GB News launched as a business, it could have launched as an online only business. GB News chose to be regulated by Ofcom, chose to be on that TV spectrum. I think for two reasons. Firstly, there is a certain amount of prestige to linear television. I don't know how much longer that will be, but I think there is definitely an amount of prestige to that. I had a TikToker on one of my shows during the general election for sort of the youth perspective. He's got millions of followers on TikTok, but still posted about going on the TV because the TV holds this sort of cultural value. Even though there are millions of people who, watch TikTok every day, it's sort of...
It's a bit the equivalent of newspapers still having print editions, right? You sort of feel it's only a serious newspaper if it's got a print edition, even if that's a sort of, a dying part of the proposition to market. It's sort of, you wouldn't take a news site as seriously if it was just a blog or an internet site. It needs to sort of you need to be able to go and buy it in a newsagent, right?
Yeah, it's a matter of prestige, and it feels sort of more real, but also I think there is something in terms of if you're going to offer something to the British public. Choosing to be regulated by the regulator that regulates the other guys, I think it does put you in the mainstream, and it does say that actually, look, we're here to play fair. We don't want to be accused of any sort of bias one way or the other. We want to give a fair hearing to all sides, and ultimately that is the core of the business model. It would be a very boring show if everyone agreed with each other 100% of the time. but given that we sort of made that big, open, comprehensive offer, I think it is strange that actually, given that the channel does its level best to provide sort of all sides of the spectrum, only then to be hit by some Ofcom fines. I mean, the most ridiculous one, of course, was when we offered that People's Forum, we call it.
Oh, for Rishi Sunak. Yeah.
Right, we offered one to Keir Starmer as well.
Yeah.
But we couldn't find a date, or he wanted to see how the Rishi Sunak one went. Starmer's office wanted to see how that went before he did his. So we did that one first, and then Ofcom go and fine us for it. I mean, it starts to sort of feel a bit like, you know what, we're trying to play fairly here, and the refs changing the rules in the middle of the game. So I think there is a bit of a perhaps a misunderstanding there. That does need to be ironed out.
Why not just scrap Ofcom? Would you just get rid of it? I mean, it might be that there's actually some boring, prosaic, technical things it needs to regulate about where wires are put down or something. But in terms of bias, why should it have any function at all?
Yeah, I mean, we've got a perfectly functioning, self-regulating newspaper industry. It does seem strange that we've attached this special status to television, and perhaps
well, it's a legacy thing, isn't it? When back in the day you could only really get news from BBC One or ITV. When I was a kid, I'm old enough to remember when Channel 4 launched. So I was used to just having 3 channels, and therefore, TV broadcast news, you only had a couple to pick from, and you can sort of understand the rationale of regulating that because it's sort of a monopoly or a duopoly. But now you can get your news from a zillion. There's perfect competition. It's arrived.
Right, and I think people attach a certain weight to TV news, but they can also be discerning customers, and sort of thinking that TV news is, it holds cultural weight doesn't mean that people can't discern for themselves what is being said and the perspective from which news comes. I think actually a much more honest form of balance in television is saying, look, my name's Tom Harwood, I'm presenting this show, I think this, other views are available. We're going to have someone on who profoundly disagrees with what I think, and you can go away and make up your own mind. But I'm not going to hide what I think from you. I think in some ways that's actually a form of bias by omission. If you're pretending to be completely objective, but anyone who knows the subject can see that you're only asking questions from a certain perspective, well, that's a much more duplicitous form of bias than simply being honest and open with the audience, saying, this is where I stand. Please feel free to disagree with me. I have a million guests on who disagree with me, but that's the kind of conversation that actually makes good telly.
And well, just to show that PopConners are pretty united, Ofcom should be abolished, was the proposition. Strongly agree 45%, agree 34%, don't know 13%, disagree 7%, strongly disagree 1%. Who knew that Rory Stewart or Alistair Campbell were on this call? There you go. How do you, Valerie Coker asked this, she made us as left, she said she could only stay for the first half hour, but she asked, how do you go about trying to ensure that you're even-handed? If your show over lunchtime with Emily, okay, you're going to cover this particular issue, how do you make sure that you have, if there was no Ofcom, no regulation, it was just the sort of self-denying ordinance that you wanted different viewpoints to be heard. How do you ensure that and make sure you're not just hearing only from Brexiteers about the EU or only from climate change skeptics about carbon net zero, for example?
Yeah, well, I've got my hat goes off to our booking teams who do work and throughout the day and night to make sure that we have guests from all sides that come on. I know that we very often say that we're doing this story. We might do, it's a 3-hour show. We might do this story this hour, this hour, this hour, and we might not have time to do 2 guests on that one story in that 1 hour. So we'll alternate each hour with a guest from one perspective and a guest from another perspective. But also sometimes, frankly, we don't have people who are willing to come on to defend a certain proposition, and that's sad because we always want people who will come on and disagree. So we do reach out to. I mean, if it's a government story, we reach out to get a statement from whether it's the Home Office or the Treasury or whatever. But also, I think a huge responsibility relies on presenters knowing the subject that they're asking questions about and knowing enough about the subject. I mean, believe it or not, we don't just turn up at 12 for a show that starts at 12. We have to get in rather earlier than that in the morning and know your onions about the story you are asking questions about. So if someone says a point of view says a point from one point of view, you can come back and say, well, the other side say this. And you don't have to say, I think this, but as long as you put forward that case, you're having an interesting conversation and you're diving deeper into the subject. There's a concept called the ideological Turing test. And Turing tests have become very in vogue because Turing tests, the original Turing tests, of course, named after Alan Turing, were an original test to see if AI was really artificial intelligence. Can a computer have a realistic conversation with you and you think it a person rather than a computer? The ideological Turing test is a version of that where it's can you tell the ideology that someone you're talking to actually has? Can you, as a free marketeer, make a convincing case as a socialist, or vice versa? And it's an interesting intellectual challenge for yourself. Can you make the case that the person you disagree with would make, and can you make that case convincingly?
Now, one of the problems we hear that GB News has had, which some people put in the whole remit of cancel culture, has been advertiser boycotts. I mean, I absolutely promise as a GB News fan that one day I will go and stay at the Thomas Paine Hotel. And I also promise that when I'm next in Swansea, I will trade in a piece of gold with Swansea gold and silver. And if I ever make it to Pontypridd, I think there's a furniture store there as well who can. But what's actually happened here? Why aren't we seeing more? I mean, I'm not criticising those businesses at all. I'm applauding them.
But they're great businesses. Great businesses that we should all.
It's fantastic. But it reminds me a little bit of sort of the adverts that you get in a local cinema. Go and eat at the local tandoori or something. Yeah. Why aren't you getting? I don't know. Coca-Cola and Volvo and Marks and Spencers and the rest of it. Is there an effort to try and throttle GB News, or is it just a totally understandable, perhaps nervousness by established brand names that maybe GB News is seen as a little quirky, a little bit controversial, and probably better to stick to the legacy media for their advertising output?
So I think there are three parts to this answer. Firstly, I think if you're a regular viewer of GB News, you might have seen in the last month or so that the adverts are becoming a little bit more national. And actually, there's a bit more of a diversity of adverts starting now. I think basically that's coming with the new widely understood viewing figures. Once we've had, not just sort of the odd day or the odd week, but actually monthly figures that show more people watch GB News than Sky News, etc. That becomes a much easier, I suppose, fact to put forward in any negotiation with any advertiser. But secondly, and this is a really interesting point, some of those companies that technically would be part of that boycott on linear television are very happy to advertise on gbnews.com.
Right.
Because on website advertising, it's programmatic. People see different adverts depending on who they are. It's much more targeted. It's much more valuable to the people who are doing the advertising, because they can say, I only want men to see this, or I only want teenagers to see this, or I only want to see, women in Swansea to see this. Therefore, what we see is actually a lot of commercial sort of ease with gbnews.com. But the problem is when you advertise on linear TV, everyone sees you.
Yeah. No, I can remember.
And that makes the boycott campaign, and there is an organized campaign trying to take down GB News and trying to defund GB News. It means that whenever there is an advertiser who advertises on GB News, they get this campaign going after them, and it is frankly nasty and pernicious,
Yeah,
and it does show that there is a concerted effort to try and break down plurality in the media that only want
yeah, yeah.
one voice to be heard.
But maybe
But
we're.
that's
Do you
where
think,
GP's
Tom?
membership comes into.
Yeah. Do you think that we might, maybe we've sort of said, what, are we moving to a more narrow casting world in which there's a plethora of choices for different discrete audience? Perhaps that's happening in advertising as well. I can remember 20 years ago logging into my Facebook page and finding it an amazing coincidence that all of the adverts were trying to sell me Southampton Football Club merchandise. I was like, what an amazing coincidence. I mean, I've never seen
Southampton's
Southampton
bought
advertising.
Facebook advertising for the day.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. But they obviously, the algorithm knew I was a
Yeah.
supporter of the team and everything. I mean, Christopher Marshall asks, should GB News audiences complain to companies who are boycotting GB News? We've seen sort of customer reaction in America against wokery, Bud Light, the standout
Yeah.
example, and saying, well, if you're going to go all woke like that, I'm going to boycott it. Shouldn't, I mean, rather than us just, noting that sort of leftist, slightly authoritarian activists want to defund GB News or hit its advertising revenue, there's nothing stopping us writing to companies saying, why on earth aren't you advertising on GB News? I promised. I also promised to visit Poland. That's the other thing I need to do in order to keep your advertisers
Very safe
happy.
country, actually. But I think there is. I think there is a lot of merit to that. I think one of the peculiar things that a generation of jumpy executives haven't quite understood, that whilst 50 tweets looks like a lot, it's not a lot.
Mhm.
But the problem is, whilst there might be, tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people who are delighted to learn of your product or service, and there are 100 people very angry that you've chosen to advertise on GB News. It's almost like a lot of executives are too jumpy at this fact, or can't add up. And I think to some extent, what we've seen with the a cultural U-turn in the United States, with this sense that actually, conservatives sometimes buy things too, or perhaps more often buy things.
Yeah,
Just because there is a loud minority on a social media website, perhaps that doesn't always align with commercial incentives. That's a lesson that's been learned in the United States. I wonder if more people would sort of speak up on the other side, perhaps that would count for something. I think it was Burke who said that there might be 50 crickets in a field making lots of noise, but they are outmassed by the thousands of oxen quietly stood there.
yeah.
He said it in a much more poetic way than I possibly could. But the oxen, the old English oxen, the crickets sound louder, but the oxen weigh more.
Yeah, yeah. Jeff Townley says he's going to Poland for his holiday this year. Good man, Jeff. Top country is Poland. I think it's
Very
about to
cheap
open.
beer too. We very much appreciate that.
And he's am I right to say Poland is on the verge of overtaking the UK in GDP per capita? I can't, it's close to. I'm not sure it's quite made it yet, but that's quite something, isn't it?
I mean, there's a brilliant Twitter account, completely off topic, called Yimby Poland, that just shows how much Poland's changed in the last 10 or 15 years. They build things. Their cities are looking less and less Soviet and more capitalist because they've allowed people to build it. And also they're building things in traditional styles as well. I mean, it's a fantastic thing to see. I mean, all of these Polish cities just suddenly burgeoning. I think we've got a lesson or two to learn from their planning system.
I wanted to talk to you about the dear old BBC as well. Where do you see the future going here? I mean, it is surely now preposterous that there is a compulsory television license for owning a piece of kit that you may very well use to broadcast lots of other to receive pictures, moving pictures from a whole variety of different broadcasters, and never even look at the BBC. Their privileged status, I mean, it's got to come to an end, this, hasn't it? And I almost think it's not in the BBC's own interests to cling on to the license fee. If it was a subscription service, I think they could actually become a much more successful company. They can't really compete with Netflix at the moment. I mean, they might never get to quite that level, but you could theoretically say, right, well, if you want all of the BBC content, it's, I don't know, 250 quid a year. If but if you don't, if there's some channels you don't want, I haven't got kids, so I don't really need to see BBs, for example, scratch that one out. It's got to come to an end, this, isn't it? And again, it's sort of a legacy issue. You could understand back in the day when, if you were beaming television pictures into number 5 Acacia Avenue, then the person at number 6 Acacia Avenue could get those pictures as long as they had a TV set and a coat hanger. But now, of course, if I don't pay my Sky Sports subscription, Sky Sports stops sending me football. If I don't I don't pay my Netflix subscription, I don't get Netflix. This switch off ability, surely to God, means that we're in the last few years of the compulsory license fee. Do you not think?
Yeah, I think you put it perfectly. I mean, this used to be a non-excludable good, and for quite some time now, it has been an excludable good. You don't have to fund it through a tax, you can fund it through a subscription. And the most remarkable thing that I see always when it comes to this conversation is people who defend the current license fee setup always say, oh, but you get all of this for what is it, 50p a day or something, and they say, look at all the channels you get. I mean, this is better value than Netflix. It's like, okay, sure, if it is, then why are you so afraid at selling the proposition that you are currently trying to sell me?
Yeah.
It looks like you think this is a great deal and would be an easy sell. Why are you so afraid of selling it
Yeah.
in that case? And I love the BBC. I think there's so much that the BBC does that is so good. I mean, I've mentioned it before, the Gavin and Stacey Christmas special. It brought the country together. Nothing had been seen to that extent that wasn't sport for a very long time. And there's some great stuff that the BBC does.
And it has an incredible archive, obviously, absolutely
Yeah.
unbelievable archive. Yeah.
I mean, it's such a valuable commercial entity. And yet, sadly, because governments, both blue and red, have stuck to this anachronistic funding model, it
Mhm.
has been starved of funding. They're sort of a shadow of their former selves. Actually, the BBC could be a much greater organization if it became a commercial enterprise. Now, the argument against that is that there's some genuine public service broadcasting. And I think the World Service is basically a good thing for UK PLC. That could be funded out of the Foreign Office budget. That could be a bit of general taxation going towards that. I just don't see why general taxation or a license fee specific taxation should have to pay for sort of Radio 1
Yeah.
or Radio 1 Extra.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I like RuPaul's Drag Race, but I'm not quite sure why my granny has to pay for it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Do
I,
you,
I,
do you think, Tom, if you were the Director General of the BBC, I guess the judgment they have to make is you either sort of go mainstream and then say how popular Match of the Day is and RuPaul's Drag Race or Strictly Come Dancing or whatever, and you sort of say, look, it's amazing, Gavin and Stacey, millions of people are watching this stuff, isn't it brilliant? Or you actually say, no, we're going to produce, we're going to have cheese rolling from Gloucestershire, not Premier League football, because that otherwise wouldn't be on television. If you want Premier League
yeah.
football, you can get TNT Sports, Sky Sports. If you want Formula One, there's a Formula One channel, etc., etc. So we're going to do, cheese rolling from Gloucestershire, which otherwise wouldn't be brought to you. Do you think it should actually, rather than, I mean, one possible strategy is it tries to expand, sells license fees to Americans. If they want BBC, you could probably bring in billions from America.
BBC America already broadcasts in the States with adverts, might I add. It was a very
with
good
adverts.
experience when I looked at the BBC with adverts. But
or you could say we're going to do cheese rolling and songs of praise and a night at the opera.
I have to say, GB
whatever.
News did cover the cheese rolling last year, and it was a marvelous thing. But
Right.
I don't see why you can't have a two-speed BBC. You sort of have a core BBC that's the seminal documentaries and the stuff that you might expect to see on BBC Four, and maybe that funds Radio 4 as well. I'm not sure. And you can sort of have your core stream BBC that's cheap and perhaps public service broadcasting. And then you have your second stream BBC that has all the bells and whistles and frankly commercial panel shows or
Yeah.
I don't know, like the Traitors. I mean, the Traitors could easily be on Netflix or Disney Plus or BBC or the ITV player, whatever they call that now, the BritBox service they do, all of these things. I mean, there's no reason why these shows have to be on one service or another. There's nothing sort of uniquely BBC about all of these shows, whether it's Wolf Hall or The Traitors. I mean, these things could exist very happily and
So
do
you could
exist very
you might
happily.
also take the view in the non-mainstream stuff, such as, I don't know, religious broadcasting for sake of argument, or obscure sports or whatever. There's no need to peg that to the BBC, right? You could potentially, if you believe in public service broadcasting, I'm not sure I do, but if you did believe in it, you could have a pot of money that says, we actually think it's quite important that opera is broadcast on terrestrial television. But it doesn't seem to me to matter much whether it's broadcast on BBC One, BBC Two, Channel 4, Sky Arts, the Discovery Channel. Any channel should be able to bid for that public funding if you believe that we should. I'm sorry, I question this, but if you believe we should subsidise some sort of television, presumably obscure stuff that wouldn't be made anyway, why should that be the monopoly of the BBC? Somebody else could have a night of the opera on their own channel, publicly funded. That seems to me the way round to do it.
Yeah, I mean, quite possibly. I think one of the underappreciated elements in this entire conversation is the conversation we were having earlier. How linear TV is not really linear TV at all anymore. Every company that provides linear TV also has a website, also has written journalism, also has a YouTube channel and a TikTok account and an Instagram and a Facebook page and all the rest of it. And it's an entire digital entity. And
Yeah,
for the BBC, I think it's been underappreciated the crowding out that has occurred, particularly when it comes to local news
yeah,
and
yeah.
local newspapers that have died a very sad death right across the country, that no longer hire the kind of young local journalists that they used to. I mean, the number of older people in the lobby in Parliament who work their way up through local
As
journalism.
cub reporters on the Staffordshire Gazette or whatever. Yeah.
Exactly, that just doesn't happen anymore. I mean, that is not a pathway for new young journalists in the way that it used to be, and a lot of that is because instead of going and picking up a local paper or going to your local paper's website, which are all frankly hell to use, partly because and it's this negative spiral, right? People start clicking on the BBC local website for their local stories, which means the local website for the local newspaper has to make more and more of its screen space adverts and those sticky adverts that never scroll away and you can't X because they
They're
need
a right
revenue.
nightmare.
And they
Yeah.
get
It's
worse, so
yeah,
then
yeah,
fewer people click on them, so then they
yeah,
get
yeah.
more adverts and they get worse. I mean, it's a terrible, terrible spiral. To some extent, catalyzed by BBC local news. And there's a big question mark to have over, well, why are we paying to we're paying taxes to the BBC in effect to put local papers out of business. It seems like not a healthy thing.
Yeah. Let's come back a bit to GB News. I said I wanted to challenge you on it a bit, and our audience, I think, will principally be members of the Conservative Party. We're quite eclectic. We have reformers and sort of independent people who roughly agree with our position, but we tilt towards people who are members of the Conservative Party. And this is a theme that I have heard barked at me a bit as an occasional person who appears on GB News. Is GB News basically reform TV, right? Why has it become the Nigel Farage fan club? Chris Calvert asks, what has it become the fan club of Nigel Farage? Dorothy Roberts points out that Farage has been given hugely greater amount of airtime, and Jacob Rees-Mogg has had his airtime reduced, and I think given to Matt Goodwin, who's probably not an official reform spokesman, but it inhabits that sort of area. Is that would you accept some of these criticisms? I mean, reform, they are doing very well in the opinion polls at the moment, but they do only have 5 MPs, and they did come third in vote share at the last election. What would you say to the accusation that they're given rather a higher slice of the pie on GB News than a sort of strictly even-handed and proportional approach to party politics might allow them?
Well, there was some polling done before the last election that was looking at what GB News viewers, how GB News viewers were voting, and actually it surprised me in terms of who the majority of GB News viewers were voting for, which was the Labour Party. Um, and I think it was a second Conservative, third Reform. Um, but by far and away the vast plurality, and I think it might have even been a majority, depending on if they were regular viewers or occasional viewers, was the Labour Party. Now, there aren't any Labour MPs with shows on GB News. Gloria De Piero, the former Labour MP, does interviews and hosts the PMQ's show, and she's brilliant. But I think she doesn't have the sort of primetime slot, of course, that Nigel Farage has. But despite that, I think people make up their own minds over what is said on the channel. I think it's always difficult when you have people who either fit in the politician category or are questionable, are they politicians? And I think we as a company have sometimes actually struggled with realizing what Ofcom qualifies as a politician or who isn't a politician, because there are
Right.
different rules in terms of what politicians.
I mean, but 40% of Reform MPs have their own show on GB News, and
Oh, that's only
and
if you. That's only if you. I mean, Lee Anderson does a one hour a week. So I think that makes up those numbers in a huge way. But ultimately, I think there is the argument that in the last 7 opinion polls, Reform have either been first or second. In the last YouGov poll, they're first. In the last Find Out Now poll, they're first. Perhaps there is a correction within GB News because you don't see so much of it elsewhere in the media, and it's trying to reflect the country as a whole. But ultimately, of Reform MPs, that is sort of 1 hour a day. If you're looking at the weekday schedule, it's the 7 p.m. show. Although you say Jacob Rees-Mogg has gone down to 2 days a week, I think Nigel has gone down to 2 days or 3 days a week because of his roles as an MP. Because he does Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, if I'm not mistaken now, whereas it used to be 4. So I think these things chop and change all the time. But I'm not sure I kind of recognise the view that GB News is Reform TV. Certainly,
and might part of it be that I mean, shouldn't the obligation set on MPs from other parties? I mean, Darrell Godliffe says the Conservatives are policy light, and Labour can't even fill a full day in Parliament. I mean, maybe Reform have taken a polling lead because they're the only party with some kind of idea about the clear direction they want to take the country in. I mean, one of the frustrations I think a lot of us PopConners have had with Kemi, whilst being hugely sympathetic to her, is, are we really going to wait 2 years before we roll out some policy positions? I mean, that would be quite boring on your show, wouldn't it? You're joined by a Conservative MP who says, that's a very interesting question.
Think anything at all.
I will answer you in 2027.
I think that might be part of it, but I also think whoever is Conservative Party leader right now is going to have an awful time of it, because any criticism they make of the Labour Party, and you see it every week in PMQs, Kemi will say something and will make a sharp shooting criticism of Labour Party policy, and she'll fire her missiles across that way at the government benches. And then Keir Starmer will say, yes, but when you were in government, and then fire over a bunch of missiles, and it's mutually assured destruction. Every Wednesday I see this in the House of Commons. This side throw their missiles, this side throw their missiles, and they take each other out. Who's laughing? It's the third parties, the people that weren't in power either in the last 14 years or the last 7 months. Because frankly, everyone knows that the country feels a bit broken right now. And frankly, I think that most countries across the Western world feel a bit broken right now. We only have to look at, it's 15 days until the Germans go to vote, and the party of government is going to come in third. You look across to Canada, Trudeau's Liberals. There are some polls that put them in fourth in terms of seats.
Jeez, really?
Yeah, there was one poll. This was before Trudeau resigned, so it might have recovered a bit for them now. But there was one poll that had the Liberals going down to single-digit seats in the way that the Conservatives did in Canada in the 1993 election. Of course, what happened to Kamala Harris in the States. Macron's parliamentary majority has collapsed. I mean, all of these countries are all feeling the effects of the global post-COVID tumult, the effects of higher interest rates, the effects of that huge inflation, the energy crisis. This has made everyone in all of these countries deeply unhappy. And so, of course, they blame their incumbent government. Starmer's not doing too well. But also, they blame the government that was in power when all this stuff started to turn sour. Now, this is true across all these governments. I mean, it's even true in Australia, which is generally insulated from this stuff. But the Labour Party are going to lose the next election, and the Liberals are going to get in. Liberals, of course, being the sort of Conservative Party in Australia.
Yeah.
Basically, anywhere where you look around the world, people who have been incumbent over these last 3 or so years, the sort of post-COVID shock to the system, the post-quantitative easing, the oh no, we've borrowed and printed far too much money and now it's the cold bath we have to take afterwards and everyone feels completely dreadful. This is having effects not just on the parties that have just left power, but the incumbents too. So it's the most fertile territory possible that you could possibly imagine for a party like Reform to come and say, look, we weren't part of that mess and we're not part of this mess, vote for us. It's a very, very hard thing for any Conservative leader to sort of convince people that they'll be different.
Yeah, I mean, it is a fascinating time in Western politics, isn't it? It does feel like we are going through a pretty dramatic realignment. I mean, Donald Trump might well be the Republican Party president, but the Republican Party is transformed out of all recognition from the kind of country club Republicans of Romney and McCain and Rockefeller and that ilk. And then in a lot of other countries, you're seeing the surge of completely new parties. I forget Maloney's party, whatever it's called, but obviously the AFD, the National Rally in France. It does seem that it's not just the establishment media that might be dying. Quite a lot of establishment parties seem to be under threat as well. As you rightly say, the Conservatives, I think, are typically just behind Reform in most of the opinion polls at the moment. Some nice comments about GB News. Where was it? Well done for their investigative journalism. Kyle Steely says, do you think this is where journalism should focus its efforts? Certainly, what's his name? Charlie Peters. Charlie Peters has done a hell of a lot on really good stuff. He deserves an award of some sort.
Oh, absolutely. But knowing the awards industry, he won't get one.
Yeah. Although Farage has won a couple, hasn't he, as the best presenter? But that's when the public
these
vote.
Are People's Choice Awards. These are the awards where the public votes. The problem is, it's such a rack. This is, I mean, I don't know how much I should say, but the industry sort of thoughts as to why Sky News launched their daily climate show a few years ago. You know, an hour of television dedicated to climate change. Which was then quickly pared back into, I think, about 15 minutes once a week. But apparently that was all just to sort of angle for some sort of award in one of these. I think journalism is better when it doesn't aim to win awards, because generally, if you're trying to win an award, you're probably not speaking truth to power.
Yeah. Just on the license fee, I've got the results in now. I think this will probably surprise nobody on this call. The mandatory BBC license fee should be abolished. Strongly agree 78%, agree 10%, don't know 10%, disagree 2%, strongly disagree 0. I'd be interested to know, I think we've got a poll about what people think about GB News as well, which we'll put up now just to wrap things up on how important do you think GB News is in bringing balanced political debate to the UK, that it's been a corrective against quite a lot of the legacy media. Would be interested to hear your thoughts on that. Where do you see it going next then, Tom? Do you think it's, you're on a good incremental growth curve, just stay with that? Or do you think that perhaps the issues that have sort of motivated GB News viewers, and I'm guessing here, it might be a stretch, tell me if I'm wrong, but, who might be very concerned about immigration for sake of argument and felt that they were not getting in-depth news coverage about immigration issues. Those are issues which aren't just now sort of, there's a particular demographic that's interested in it. These seem to be the defining issues of our political debate in Britain now. Immigration, carbon net zero, certainly dialing up in terms of salience, the kind of malfunctioning state, two-tier justice systems, wokery, all of these things aren't really just a sort of a segment of, Mr. Angry from Tunbridge Wells. These now seem to be the defining issues of British political debate. Would you agree?
Yeah, and I think that we're seeing that. I think to their credit, it seems that the government has also seen this. If you look at the sort of the way that the language used by the Prime Minister has changed recently, I mean, some of his speeches, frankly, could have been on GB News. I think he really recognises that this is where the next election is going to swing. In some ways, it might be the GB News election, the next election, given where all of these different swing constituencies will be, where the debate will be held. I mean, these are all the issues, and we don't just talk about it because we like talking about it. We talk about things that matter to the people that watch the channel, and frankly, to the whole country. And I think it's right to point to the growth of the GB News audience, because it doesn't look like it's slowing down. I mean, I would not be surprised if the channel meets its internal goal of being the largest news channel in the UK. I think the goal might be by next year or the year after. But I think
that would be to overtake BBC News channel. Yeah.
Sorry.
That would be to overtake the BBC News channel.
Yes,
yeah?
exactly.
Yeah.
So that would be the largest 24-hour news channel in the UK. And when that goal was set, I think it was set about a year ago by the executives at GB News, and that was I mean, a lot of people sort of scoffed at it then, but now it seems eminently achievable, really achievable, which is a remarkable turnaround from where the company was. But I think that just, I think it's a testament to the people that sort of stuck with GB News in the days when everything was a bit ropey and the lights kept turning off, and stuck with it and saw the promise and, frankly, the gap in the market in the United Kingdom sort of media landscape. There is a gap for this, and persevering really does matter.
You'll be pleased to know, Tom, how important do you think GB News is in bringing balanced political debate to the UK? Very important, 74%. Fairly important, 16%. Don't know, 8%. Not very important, 2%. Hello, Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart. And not at all important, 0%. So amongst our audience here, we had over 100 of you on this call over the course of the last hour. You're providing a vital public service. So more power to your elbow, Tom. And thank you very much indeed for these insights into it's been spectacular, the growth of GB News. I think it's now an invaluable part of what Adam Bolton calls our delicate media ecosystem, a very, very important part of it. And it's been great to hear from you. And it's been great for me to be able to ask you some questions for a change, rather than you asking me all of the questions. I should say to our audience, we put in the chat box, if you haven't registered already, on the 10th of February at 7 p.m, I'll be in conversation with Lord Hannan. That's in the Daniel Hannan. That's in the chat box now, on the outlook for the Conservative Party and what he thinks that we need to do. And we've got upcoming PopConversations. If you'll get information in our newsletter, make sure you sign up on our website. I assume you already have, otherwise you wouldn't be on this call. But we've got Tim Montgomery coming up next month, who has obviously just switched over to Reform UK from the Conservatives. And we've got the super pollster James Frayne as well, who will tell us his insights on what the people on the ground are really thinking, GB News viewers or not. But Tom, thanks. Fascinating hour with you. Great to see you. Great to talk with you as always. More power at your elbow, and keep that GB News flag flying high, because it's a really vital part of our public discourse. So thank you very much indeed. Thanks to all of you for joining us on this call. Have a great evening. I'm now going to have a beer. Over and out. Well, thanks for watching. And if you enjoyed that video, please make sure you give it a like and subscribe to the PopCon YouTube channel. You can also find out more about us on our website, popularconservatism.com, and you can follow us on social media. Details are in the show notes below.